All right, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Bernard Prusak, and I'm the director of the King's McGowan Center for Ethics and Social Responsibility. King's is a liberal arts college sponsored by the Congregation of Holy Cross. We're in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, which is more or less the northeast corner of the state. This event marks our annual observance of Constitution Day, though Constitution Day, strictly speaking, is tomorrow, September 17, commemorating the signing of the Constitution in Philadelphia 234 years ago on September 17, 1787. So happy Constitution Day Eve to everybody joining us. This is also the kickoff event of homecoming this year at King's. So a special welcome to alumni and alumni of the college, and thanks to Beth Dougherty and Freddie Pettit for their collaboration with the Ethics Center. It's my pleasure to extend special thanks to our three speakers on our topic this year, namely the Electoral College, our constitutionally mandated method for presidential elections. And I will introduce our colleagues in the order of presentation. So Dr. Tom Mackaman is Associate Professor. You should wave, Tom, I think. There he is. He's Associate Professor of History at King's. His research is focused on labor and immigration history and is the author of the book New Immigrants and the Radicalization of American Labor, 1914 to 1924. He also co-edited the volume The New York Times 1619 Project and the Racialist Falsification of History, which was published just this last March, and is a left-wing critique of the Times' project. Dr. Michael Moreland, there you go. Dr. Michael Moreland is University Professor of Law and Religion and Director of the Eleanor H. McCullen Center for Law, Religion, and Public Policy at Villanova University. He is a scholar of constitutional law, torts, bioethics, and religious freedom. Before joining the law faculty at Villanova, he served as a clerk in the United States Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit and as Associate Director for Domestic Policy at the White House under President George W. Bush. This is Mike's third, I think I have that right, Constitution Day for us, and I hope that the fourth time we'll be able to host him again on campus. We give a pin, too, once you do 4 Constitution Day events, so next year. Thanks again for joining us. Finally, Dr. Ayesha Ray is Associate Professor of Political Science at King's. She is the author of the books The Soldier and the State in India, Nuclear Weapons, Counterinsurgency, and the Transformation of Indian Civil-Military Relations, and also Culture, Context, and Capability, American and Indian Counterinsurgency Approaches. Her research focuses on political violence, conflict, war, defense, and security in South Asia. We were talking briefly before the event. She's really quite busy lately with all the events in Afghanistan and Pakistan and Kashmir and India. So thank you for joining us. Let me just talk about nuts and bolts briefly. Each panelist will speak for about 10 to 12 minutes. Each panelist has slides that he or she will share with us. Then they'll engage one another in a bit of discussion, and finally we'll turn to Q&A. Q&A will make up more or less half this event. We'll go until around 8:15. That's the plan. For the Q&A, please send questions through the chat to me, Bernard Prusak, and I'll do my best to get your questions into the mix. As you probably know already from joining us, this event is being recorded. The recording will be posted on both the McGowan Center's YouTube channel and Facebook page, and I'll also send you a link of the recording most likely later tonight. So that's it from me. Thank you again for joining us, and thanks to our 3 speakers. I'm really interested in hearing what you have to say. So, Tom, you're up first as our historian.
All right. Thank you, Bernard. And thanks everyone for having us and joining us this evening. Let me do my screen share here so I can pull up my slides. The Electoral College is one very small part of the Constitution, and it's outlined specifically in Article 2, Section 1. And I'd like to first consider the question of it's whether it's I guess we're asking whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. And I'd like to consider that first abstractly. Considered abstractly means to me that first we're taking it out of its the historical context of its creation, and second, that we're taking it separated from the moments in which it has intersected in the past with elections in American history, and third, taking it in isolation from its particular role in what I would call a crisis of democracy that we've been undergoing in the United States for the past couple decades. So viewed even abstractly in this way, the Electoral College would tend to confirm the, I would say, rather negative view of the Constitution that is now trending in popular history writing, including in the Times 1619 Project, for example. I don't share that negative view, I should say, about the Constitution or the other founding documents of the United States. Of course, it has to be noted at the outset that the framers of the Constitution also put in place a measure to change the Constitution through the process of amendment. Now, the last time that a plan was afoot to change the Electoral College to a proportional system of representation that I know of, at least, came in 1979 and was pushed by Jimmy Carter and Indiana Senator Birch Bayh. It was soundly defeated. The Electoral College has had a vexed history from the beginning. According to one historian, no other constitutional provision gave the founders so much difficulty in its formulation. The subject of the method of electing a president was brought up in the Constitutional Convention on 21 different days and occasioned over 30 distinct votes on various phases of the subject. Over the years, no other provision has drawn so much criticism, provoked so many constitutional amendments as has the Electoral College Clause. Close to 700 proposals to amend the Electoral College scheme have been introduced into Congress since the Constitution was inaugurated. Returning to the abstract problems, just if you sort of look at it from just the standpoint of principle, let's say, it seems to me clear that that it's less than the highest democratic ideal. And viewed in this negative light, it might be considered sort of an arcane relic of the Constitutional Convention of 1787. Here are some of the problems. One, it's a winner-take-all system in which that's awarded state by state. And so if the 49%, if you're part of the 49% that didn't vote the right way, you're not directly represented. Second, it creates a situation in which it may happen that the winner of the most votes also loses the election. Three, it defies the principle of one man, one vote, as if you do the math, it will turn out that one man or woman in Wyoming, least populous state, has very nearly 3 times the representation in the Electoral College of a man or woman voting in California, the most populous state. And finally, 4, it may suggest to some that perhaps the American people don't really have the right to vote directly for the president at all. But of course, these are not merely abstract concerns. They certainly have emerged in recent years very concretely, as I said, in the crisis of American democracy. Take, for example, the winner-take-all system. We understand that there is a widespread belief, though totally unfounded, among Republicans that Donald Trump, I shouldn't say Republicans, some Republicans, that Trump actually won the last election. The election, as we also know, came down to very close vote counts in a number of states, including Pennsylvania. The situation in these states going into the election and then right on up to the ratification of their votes was very tense. If the vote count could be shifted by about 1%, then all of Pennsylvania's or Arizona's or Nevada's or Georgia's or Michigan's, not 1% of those states' delegates, but 100% of those state delegates would go from Biden to Trump. In no case did this actually happen, though in each of these states, the actual vote was excruciatingly close. Now, if there were proportional representation, and in these states, Biden won 51% of delegates and Trump won 49%, there would be little need for such intense fights over a few thousand votes. In any case, Republican efforts to shift the vote, as we know, ultimately focused on January 6th, not at all accidentally, the traditional day when Congress in joint session ratifies the Electoral College count. It appears that the far-right mob that raided the Capitol building that day hoped to intervene against what has been traditionally a de rigueur ratification of the Electoral College. I don't know of anything quite like this in American history. Consider the second issue, the possibility that a candidate could win the popular vote and still lose the election. Of course, this is, as we know, not really hypothetical at all. It's happened twice in the last 2 decades. In the Bush versus Gore election of 2000, won by Gore in the popular vote, but eked out by Bush in the Electoral College. And in 2016, when Hillary Clinton prevailed in the popular vote by a couple of million, but still lost the election. And there are a few other elections like this in American history. And they each provoked a crisis. The election of John Quincy Adams over Andrew Jackson in 1824, which because of anger in the Jackson camp led to the formation of the Democratic Party, the oldest mass political party on the planet, by the way. And then in 1876 with the election of Rutherford B. Hayes over Samuel Tilden, that resulted, that there was a resolution to that, a kind of shady resolution that averted what some feared would be yet another civil war a decade after the end of the Civil War in 1865. And the shady deal here included the ending of Reconstruction, which ultimately led to the imposition of Jim Crow segregation in the South. So not a small matter at all. And then the third, going from the abstract to the concrete again here, that we don't actually have a real one-man, one-vote system within the current framework of the two-party political system. And by the way, I always tell my students this, you won't find in the Constitution anything about there being two political parties. It's just tended to work out that way. But this situation, as we know, recently has tended to favor Republican candidates, in as many of the least populous states tend to be the reddest states. And you can see side-by-side maps here, one a population density map, and you can see the denseness of the population on the coasts and the industrial Northeast, the Great Lakes states that are traditionally blue, and the red states much less populated. And then there's the fourth issue, the idea that Americans don't actually have the right to vote directly for the president. This is also not hypothetical. My reading of it, this was the essence of the ruling handed down by the Supreme Court 5-4 to stop the voting, stop the counting of votes in the Bush versus Gore election, under the argument that continuing to count the votes would do irreparable harm to the cause of George W. Bush. The court's majority, whose intervention handed the election to Bush, stated, "The individual citizen has no federal constitutional right to vote for electors for the president of the United States unless and until the state legislature chooses a statewide election as the means to implement its power to appoint members of the Electoral College. The state legislature may, if it so chooses, select the electors itself, which indeed was the manner used by the state legislatures in several states for many years after the framing of the Constitution." Now, of course, against this negative view of the Electoral College, it can also be pointed out, once again abstractly, that the Electoral College system of electing the president, granting some legal and judicial tweaking over the years, including an amendment in 1804, the 12th Amendment, nonetheless, it's prevailed since 1787. And in that nearly 230-year time span, a number of political systems based on some form of proportional representation have come and gone, often in catastrophic fashion. The example of Weimar Germany giving way to Hitler's Third Reich springs to mind. So obviously we're talking about more than just formal electoral issues here. So where does the problem come from? And I'd say it goes all the way back to Philadelphia 1787, the Constitutional Convention. What was the problem then? It was not, as progressive historians such as Charles Beard surmised, that the framers feared democracy. Actually, what Madison and Hamilton, and maybe most especially Pennsylvania's James Wilson and others worried about was the petty state level politicians. And they sought a strong national government to balance against the states. But the United States was the largest republic that had ever been created. And the question arose, how would the people know who the right man for the job of the president was? And you have to remember, this is before the 24-hour news cycle and career politicians and things like that. There was a broad hope that George Washington, as they said, first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen, would also be the first president. But after Washington, how could anyone know who would be qualified? Perhaps Congress could elect the president. But if Congress did so directly, this would gravely undermine the idea of separation of powers. The executive branch would be captive to the legislative. The solution was found in the creation of an alternative Congress that would convene every 4 years with the sole duty of selecting the president, the Electoral College. It was assumed that its function would be to come up with a list of leading candidates, and only then would those notable statesmen be voted on by the House. As historian Gordon Wood notes in his new book on constitutionalism in the American Revolution, the Electoral College seemed to solve all the problems. It guaranteed the president's independence from Congress, and it carried over the previous resolution between large states and small states, which created the system of equal representation by states in the House. Bernard, how am I on time now?
It's interesting, Tom, so keep going.
Okay, all right. So, the point I wanted to end with here is this problem, if so to speak, comes out of the Constitution. Maybe a solution also can be found there. If we look at the issues of the Constitution within the framework of the revolutionary crisis, that the severing of political ties with Great Britain and the formation of the United States, it also took the form of a constitutional crisis, and that came down to a debate about representation. Everybody knows about no taxation without representation. The debate hinged on the idea of actual versus virtual representation. The Americans said, we can't be taxed if we're not represented in Parliament. And the British thought that was absurd. They said, because Parliament represents everybody. And the way that, and that sounds preposterous to us, but the way the British arrived at that was that the Parliament was the Constitution, with the king with the theory of the king in Parliament. So what emerged in the constitutional debate in the United States was, the theory was you had to have an ultimate source of sovereignty. Every state had to have an ultimate source of sovereignty. And the way the framers ultimately resolved this was by, and it's spelled out in the very first line of the American Constitution, we the people. They decided that sovereignty was rooted in the people. They did not say we the states or we the representatives of the states. They said we the people. And so I'm wondering and speculating, again, I would say very, very abstractly, to circle back to where I began, but that the question of the nature of the Electoral College, if it's taken to be subordinate to this overriding principle of the Constitution, if that might not offer a resolution. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Mike, you're next. Thanks, Tom.
Great. Thank you, Bernard. Let me share my screen as well here. There we go. Actually, I don't, that's too early. Okay, there we go. Well, thank you, Bernard, for the invitation once again to participate in the program on Constitution Day for King's College. I miss my trip up to Wilkes-Barre, but as you say, maybe in another time. And I'm also grateful to be here with my two co-panelists. So a lot of the things I'll say will be, I think, in line with some of the themes that Tom sounded, and I hope it'll generate some discussion for us. But my particular expertise is as a law professor and a scholar of constitutional law, although I have to confess I haven't done any work specifically on the Electoral College, but instead, as you'll see, I think that the Electoral College sounds in other kinds of overarching concerns that we have as part of our constitutional design. And I know these are kind of wordy, but that's that's what happens when you don't hire a graphic designer to do your PowerPoint. One thing that I want to just say at the outset by way of background is the difference between an approach to conducting elections and authority in a political system between direct democracy versus a constitutional and federal republic. And this is, of course, is a often sounded type of a theme, but that, as Tom says, there's a lot of debate about, was it that the founders were suspicious of democracy, or what were their concerns, and things about Madison's comments in Federalist Papers, which I'll actually mention a little bit later, about concerns about faction and so forth. But I don't think there's much doubt that there was a kind of a suspicion, or at least in terms of institutional design, not much by way of direct democracy. A contrast, by the way, for example, with how some states do it. I was just in California over the weekend, and not so much the recall, which they had an election on Tuesday, but California has a lot of mechanisms in its state constitution for ballot initiatives. So they very frequently do direct referenda on different kinds of constitutional and ballot type initiatives. But that kind of approach was somewhat disfavored in the design of our own system. And I think it's always worth asking about, what are the advantages and disadvantages of going with a system that has a much stronger, as I say in the next point, a much stronger system of federalism, where the states retain their sovereignty in the union, limited, of course, by the powers that are given to the national government by the Constitution. And this, of course, was part of the background to the move from the Articles of Confederation, which arguably gave too much power to the states and not enough power to the national government, so that it could, for example, raise sufficient funds for national defense and so forth. And so the Constitution comes along, and while it gives some powers to the national government and to the national legislature and to the federal judiciary and to the president, at the same time, the states retain their sovereignty. And as the Supreme Court said in a case some decades ago, the states entered the federal system with their sovereignty intact. And so part of what the Constitution does is it divides sovereignty, and Tom talked about these issues of sovereignty as well. It divides it horizontally with separation of powers, which isn't really much of concern for us, but also then importantly vertically with regard to federalism between the powers of the national government and the states. And so this gets to the punchline of why it was thought to be important that the election of the president not be vested in either a direct democratic decision and a vote of all the people, which wasn't really much on offer at the time of the convention, or the method of electing the president by, say, through Congress, which would be sort of like an almost quasi-parliamentary system, which was a proposal, but the concern there would be that the president would be too beholden to Congress, and instead to have the presidential election proceed in and through the states. And so that's where you get the provision in Article 2, which I give you here. I won't read all of it, but it's familiar to many, I'm sure, so that it provides that that's how the election of the president shall be conducted in and through the states, and that while Congress has the power to determine the time of choosing the electors and the day on which they shall give their votes, and that they shall be same throughout the United States, but that otherwise a lot is left to the process of electing the president in and through the states. And I'll get to some arguments in a bit about why that might be good or why that might be bad. But again, my point here is just to show how it reflects a basic fundamental decision made at the convention about a federal system and a constitutional republic, so that the states are not, as I think sometimes there might be a temptation to think of the states as just kind of administrative departments, as you might have in some other systems, or even, for example, our sister country, the UK, from whom we broke. Really, there isn't much by way of, at least, I mean, they're the four constituent nations, but that are united in the kingdom. But there isn't really much by way of local control over things, and the Westminster Parliament has fairly plenary authority. But that was a view that was rejected by the convention, and again, I think we can come back to questions about whether we think that was a good idea or a bad idea. But that's the idea that we have, and it's nice. It's reflected in part, I think, by a hang on here, trying to get to my next slide here, in this passage from a decision by Justice, an opinion by Justice Thomas, is actually a dissenting opinion in a case involving term limits and whether the states could impose term limits on their members of Congress. And 5-4, the Supreme Court said that they could not, the states couldn't add additional qualifications to members of Congress that the Constitution itself didn't contemplate. And the sort of finer points of that case aren't of particular relevance. What I think is relevant and interesting is the argument here that Justice Thomas made in dissent on his own behalf, joined by Justice O'Connor, Justice Scalia, and Chief Justice Rehnquist in the 5-4 decision, about kind of a competing view about the national government and the states. And as he wrote in the Thornton case, the Constitution simply does not recognize any mechanism for action by the undifferentiated people of the nation. Thus, the amendment provision of Article 5 calls for amendments to be ratified not by a convention of the national people, but by conventions of the people in each state or by the state legislatures elected. Likewise, the Constitution calls for members of Congress to be chosen state by state rather than in nationwide elections. Even the selection of the president, surely the most national of national figures, is accomplished by an electoral college made up of delegates chosen by the various states, and candidates can lose a presidential election despite winning a majority of the votes cast in the nation as a whole. And he writes this in 1995, before actually there were two further elections in which that happened. In short, and I think this is an interesting way of picking up a theme that Tom sounded about we the people and popular sovereignty. Justice Thomas says, in short, the notion of popular sovereignty that undergirds the Constitution does not erase state boundaries, but rather tracks them. And so this, again, this vision of what the role that the states play and that the Electoral College is, in this view at least, would be a feature, not a bug, of the system, of the federal system that the Constitution contemplates. Well, what are some practical, I put a question mark here, practical advantages, because each of these would be subject to a lot of debate and disagreement and back and forth, some of which I try to capture here, although, as I say, a lot more could be said. So a few things. Well, one, administration of elections. Rather than have one big national election of all the tens of millions of voters, we have state-by-state elections. And that is a way of, at least arguably, having for the administration of elections and protection against concerns about, say, fraud and so forth. The concern, of course, and again, a lot to say about any of these topics, but many states are left as spectators. As we know, the presidential elections have come to turn on a relatively small number of states. Now, one can come back to that argument and say that the states that used to be the swing states are no longer the swing states, and states that didn't used to be swing states now are swing states. And so there might be some variation in which states are left as I say, spectators, and what states are the swing states where presidential campaigns are focused. But that just goes to show that at least by doing it on a state-by-state basis, there might be some benefits in administrability of presidential elections that would be much more difficult if, say, there were recounts and disputed elections. And at the national level, it's much easier to resolve those on a more local state-by-state level, but it also has the effect then of some states not being really that much of an attention in the campaign. Political scientists for a long time have debated this next point about whether or not the Electoral College produces a measure of stability and moderation, and whether the two-party system is well served by the Electoral College, and that it encourages something like stability and moderation in the selection of presidential candidates and then in the outcome of presidential elections. And this was an argument, again, political scientists, both those who are interested in more empirical type questions and those who are interested in more theoretical questions in political science, debate this a great deal. And of course, then there'd be interesting questions about, alternate systems. Are they similarly stable and moderate, or do they risk, say, in a proportionate representation system or something like that? Do you risk less stability and moderation? But again, a lot of dispute about that I think it's hard to adjudicate clearly one way or the other. And then, as I say, the counter argument to that, of course, with regard to stability and moderation, is the frustration and the anger that we've seen, especially in the last recent political era, when the popular vote winner can lose in the Electoral College. Now, one can come back to that and say, well, but that's how the campaigns are conducted. If we had a national popular vote winner to determine the outcome of the presidential election, then Democratic candidates would spend a lot more time campaigning in Houston, and Republican candidates would spend a lot more time campaigning in Los Angeles, but they don't, because, of course, by virtue of the fact that it's a state-by-state election, they give up those states usually, for the most part, though again, this varies over time. But basically, it ends up meaning that if you had different rules, you might have different outcomes, but that's the system that we have. Another argument in favor of the Electoral College people sometimes make is that it prevents a measure of factionalism. The successful presidential candidates have to have broad popular and geographic appeal, and that concentrated support in a small number of states is not enough, so that winning large margins in highly populated states in and of itself is insufficient to carry the Electoral College. Instead, you have to kind of cobble together a coalition that's more broad in the country, both geographically and in terms of population, representing different kinds of interests, rural interests, urban interests, and so forth. Now, of course, on the other side of that, and Tom mentioned this a bit in passing as well, you do have the concern that the one person, one vote principle that came to be enshrined in constitutional law over the course of the 20th century is somewhat undermined by this disproportionate power of the smaller states in the Electoral College. It's a problem, of course, and if it is a problem, it's also a feature in other aspects of the Constitution, of course, not most notably in the composition of the United States Senate. But it's another issue that I think often gets aired in these debates. And then I just kind of conclude with a question at the end: what could replace the Electoral College? A lot of people talk about something like a national popular vote winner, or something like a compact among the states, which may be itself constitutionally problematic, but a compact among the states to have their electors vote for the national popular vote winner. Of course, anything that would actually change the Electoral College as a matter of the Constitution would require a constitutional amendment, which is almost, at least under the current composition of Congress in the states, because it requires a 2/3 support in the House and the Senate and ratification by the states, it's almost impossible to imagine that anything would replace the Electoral College. And so to that extent, we're kind of stuck with it for good or ill as we have it. I just want to end on one other topic, and that is the Electoral Count Act, which is somewhat obscure, although less obscure than it was a few years ago. Federal statute enacted in 1887 that was intended to try to regularize and provide a clear mechanism for how Congress should count electoral votes. There was this contested election in 1876 that Tom mentioned, in which you had multiple slates of electors submitted from 3 states. And as you said, it almost risked reigniting the Civil War, and was in some ways the end of Reconstruction as a way of bringing about a conclusion of the election contest. And so what Congress did is they enacted this statute to try to regularize and provide a clear mechanism for how Congress should count these electoral votes. And I think it's fair to say that, especially after this last go around involving the 2020 election, that there's broad dissatisfaction with aspects of the Electoral Count Act. It's confusing in many places. Some of the ways it contemplates Congress acting are potentially problematic, but it has things like safe harbor dates so that if a state certifies its electors by a certain date, then Congress has to accept them. It has, as we saw on January 6th, these provisions for when there's a dispute about electors from a state for the House and the Senate to adjourn to their respective chambers and then vote on whether to accept or reject the challenge. But there's still some, as I say, some lack of clarity in places about the role of Congress in counting electors. And so that's given rise to calls for reform of the Electoral Vote Act to prevent this kind of contestation that could have ended in a much uglier fashion than what happened in January 6th. I'm speaking here about the way that the House and the Senate ended up counting the electors. And so I think that that's where, given that I think it's almost impossible to conceive of the Electoral College being replaced as a matter of constitutional amendment, I think that something by way of reform of the Electoral Count Act and also something by way of providing for better election mechanisms, more transparent election mechanisms. I think that that's where a lot of the energy of people should be directed in the current climate. And with that, I will conclude. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Ayesha, take it away.
Sorry, I'm just trying to maximize the screen. Yeah, there we go. Okay, thank you everyone for being here and thank you, Bernard, for the opportunity. So I'm basically going to just sort of move away from the United States a little bit and talk about a comparative perspective, you know, and there are so many different models in the world to look at, and I'll just give you all a little sampling from countries that I thought would be a useful, you know, measure. There's Germany, there's India, there's France, Canada, and South Africa that I actually look at in this presentation. So just to start with the United States, you know, the basics is that it's a winner-takes-all system. It's an indirect system through an electoral college, 538 electors, and 270 votes needed to win. And of course, the candidate who wins the maximum number of delegates becomes president, even if he or she tends to lose the popular vote. One of the, I think, problematic features of the US Electoral College compared to you know, the elections that we see in other countries, presidential elections, is that in the United States, it favors a two-party system. Predominantly, two parties are the ones that the candidates are represented from and eventually win from. And so there's very little room or scope for independent parties or smaller minority parties to be represented in this system. According to a report by the Pew Research Center, the United States is unique among most nations in the world. Besides the US, the only other democracies that indirectly elect a leader who combines the roles of head of state and head of government are Botswana, the Marshall Islands, Nauru, South Africa, and Suriname. In more than half, that's 65 of the world's 125 electoral democracies, the head of the state is directly elected by voters. Only the US has a system in which voters elect a body of electors to choose the president. The other 29 countries that indirectly elect their heads of state give that task to national legislatures. So this again is a key thing that in many of the presidential elections in other countries, it's done through the legislature and not just you know, through this separate system of an electoral college. Starting with Germany here, you know, the German president chancellor is elected by 630 members of the Bundestag, together with 630 delegates again chosen by state parliaments. A chancellor needs to receive an absolute majority, more than half of the votes in parliament to be elected. And that is where coalitions come into play. I think that's key to kind of understand how these systems are rather different from the United States. In coalitions, there are several political parties that are represented in the Bundestag, and it's unusual for a chancellor to receive an absolute majority of votes from only his or her party. To secure more than half of the votes, a larger party may then team up actually with smaller parties to form a coalition government. So for instance, in the 2013 elections, Angela Merkel's Christian Democratic Union, the CDU, and its sister party, the Christian Social Union, CSU, teamed up with the Social Democratic Party, SPD, to form a grand coalition. And then once this coalition is formed, members of the Bundestag vote to elect the chancellor. India, a very interesting and kind of a novel case, because the president in India is actually a ceremonial head, is more of a symbolic head, and you know, it's the prime minister in India who wields the majority of the power and is of course elected by members of the parliament. Now, interestingly, you know, India, actually they use this word electoral college for electing the president of India. So I found that really interesting. But this electoral college is consisted of all the elected members of both houses of parliament. That is the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha, so the members of the parliament, and of the state legislative assemblies and the union territories of Delhi and Pondicherry. So there are nearly about 5,000 electors in total who cast more than 1 million population weighted votes. So if there are like 4,896 electors in the Electoral College, you have 4,120 MLAs and about 776 members of parliament. Now, the member of parliament number, you know, kind of stays static. And what's kind of interesting in the Indian model when electing the president is that the legislative members in the assembly are actually, there's a value, a number that is assigned to them, again, depending on the states, and these numbers are very different. So in general, members of parliament's votes are worth more than the MLAs, and MLAs from bigger states, of course, count more than those from smaller ones. So, you know, it is a bit convoluted. Also, you know, we tend to think that the US electoral college system is pretty complex, but I mean, if you think about the Indian system of electing the president, I think this is a pretty complex system as well, where, say, for instance, the total value of votes of all members of each state assembly is then worked out by multiplying the number of elective seats in the assembly by the number of votes for each member. So, for example, you have, like, for the state of Andhra Pradesh, you have 175 into 159, and then it gets you a number of 27,825, and that's how you proceed with every state. So the total value of votes of all the states added together is then divided by the total number of elected members of parliament. Lok Sabha 543, Rajya Sabha 233, and that gives you the value of votes per member of the parliament. And then there's another step, which is basically held in accordance with the system of proportional representation by means of the single transferable vote. And the voting at such election is done by secret ballot. But as you can see, that this is a rather sort of a complex system as well of electing, you know, a ceremonial head who's definitely not as powerful as the United States president in a presidential system like America. And this is a parliamentary democracy, but it's still pretty complex. France. In France, the presidential election takes place every 5 years. Potential candidates must secure 500 signatures from elected officials, such as mayors and members of parliament, to secure a spot on the ballot. The election is then split up into 2 rounds. In the first round, people can vote for any of the candidates that have gathered the 500 signatures. The number of candidates since 1965 has tended to fluctuate between 6 and 12. So if no candidate receives an absolute majority of votes during the first round, the 2 candidates who receive the most votes go on to the second round of the election. No candidate in French history has ever secured a majority after just 1 round of voting. French people can then vote for either one of these 2 candidates, and then the candidate with the most votes is confirmed the new president of the republic. Canada, neighbor here, is also, pretty fascinating. In some ways, it's similar to, its model is a bit similar to India when you think of sort of the elections of the prime minister and all of that. But interestingly, the US here has an executive branch headed by an elected president that often faces off against a legislative branch. Canada, as it operates under a parliamentary system with a prime minister selected by the majority party. So if the American presidential election were to be modeled along the lines of the Canadian system, it would look a lot like America's midterm congressional elections. If the US Electoral College system became a relic of the past, then this whole idea of the key swing states would also be a thing of the past, replaced by a focus on battles in individual congressional districts, which they call ridings in Canada. With parliamentary elections, it is easier for smaller parties to gain traction. There are currently 5 established political parties with varying levels of influence in the North: the Liberals, the Conservatives, the New Democrats, the Bloc Québécois, and the Greens. And one of the disadvantages of the US electoral system here, when we look at the Canadian system, seems to be that it, again, doesn't allow for representation from more than 2 parties. Coalition building is almost impossible in the US system. And I think from all these examples, we notice that in other countries, the ability to build coalitions is one of the strengths of those countries. So if in the United States there was a model where there was a method where coalitions could be built, then it could actually change the trajectory of results and the type of candidates that the country gets significantly. South Africa's president is not elected directly by voters, but is actually chosen by parliament. The number of votes each party receives in the national election determines how many representatives the parties have in the 400-seat legislature. The members of parliament then go on to elect the president. So then, to kind of conclude in comparing where the strengths are, if we were to evaluate the US Electoral College, I'm not kind of arguing for abolishing it or for keeping it, but maybe having a constitutional amendment that could actually provide some sort of changes or reform to the college, because as it is, it seems a little outdated. So like I said, one major problem with the US system is that it gives more weight to voters in small states than those in more populous ones. That's something that has always been talked about. Each state's total allotment is based on representation in the Senate, or 2 people there in the House, which varies by population. So, I think Tom brought up that point of Wyoming, and here I've got DC, but, like if we compare even Wyoming and he had California, Wyoming is one of the least populous states, but they both get 3 electoral votes. So that's one issue and a problem. Another problem is that the US Electoral College encourages vote suppression, as Southern states always get more of an advantage. Black voter suppression took place through Jim Crow laws and inflated the electoral count of people who were not representing all the people in their state. Other critics also point out that, states get to pick their governors directly. So if states in the United States get to pick their governors directly, then regardless of voter turnout, states sort of get a set number of electoral votes in the Electoral College, but it kind of seems like to be 2 very different systems in a way. Another problem, of course, is sort of the size of the state really does not reflect sometimes the political preferences of the voters, and that can be a major problem. An advantage of the system is that there's a clear winner, though ideally the candidate with the popular vote, I think, should be the winner. And another advantage, and those who favor the Electoral College will point out that, it is definitely the bedrock of the idea of federalism, and it reflects the will of the states. My issue is, I think that the representation is less. I think it would be nice to have more than just 2 parties being able to win, these elections, and so having scope for at least minority parties or independent parties would be nice, and I guess maybe a constitutional amendment would be the way. But I'm not an expert on the Electoral College, I have to warn you. So that's where I'm going to kind of wrap it up and be ready for questions and discussions. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Really interesting. Tom, there you are. Great. So we have a number of questions, some historical, some legal, and one, Ayesha, for you already on multi-party representation. And there are others as well. So I'll do my best here. Tom, I'm going to ask the historical question first. So did it ever happen that the Electoral College deliberated over the choice of the president? So historically, has that ever taken place? The electors were named, and then they deliberated, whom should we choose?
Yes. I think that, and maybe Michael will know more about this, but at what point it became more of a formality than an actual deliberative body. I was interested, and maybe Michael can say a little bit more about that late 19th century law. Certainly early in the history of the Electoral College, it actually had this living function, and some crises emerged as the for example, in the election of 1800, it's turned over to Congress to vote on the problem was there was no separation between the presidential and the vice presidential vote, and you wound up with a tie between Thomas Jefferson, and Aaron Burr, and everybody knew that Burr was supposed to be the vice president, but Burr and his supporters got other ideas when the tie came in, and the Federalists, the opponents of the Jeffersonian faction, who were sometimes called the Democratic Republicans, seized on the possibility here to sort of hamstring Jefferson. And ultimately, interestingly, it was his rival, Alexander Hamilton, who, while he hated Jefferson, hated Burr even more, who tilted the balance to Jefferson. The amendment that I mentioned, the 12th Amendment, resolved that problem. So to try to answer the question by going to a point, I'm not exactly sure when that ended. I mean, I think the role Congress plays now has been, I believe, since the 1950s, sort of treated as more or less a formality. They're handed the votes of the Electoral College, and there's some process that takes place traditionally on January the 6th by which they just ratify these results. I don't know, maybe Michael knows a little bit more about that than I do.
Well, I think certainly by the middle of the 19th century, every state had moved to popular election in the state as the method of choosing electors. Before that, you would have, I guess, if you call it more deliberation or kind of backroom negotiation in the state legislatures and so forth. But that system, I think, was pretty well in place as the 19th century moved along. And so, to the extent the question is asking, like, did the Electoral College ever meet? Of course, they meet in their respective states, right? They don't meet as an aggregate body either now or historically. The point was that they would gather at their state capitals and then cast electoral votes for president. And then, as I say, the question was, well, how do they know who to vote for? And that's because slates of electors, again, as the 19th century moved along, that was in every state by popular election within the state. I should say, I mean, it's not a point about deliberation, but something that I neglected to mention. I'll just throw out there now as an alternative. Of course, you could have electors determined not on a statewide basis, but by, say, some kind of fractional approach, and that's what Nebraska and Maine do. They actually allocate their electors by congressional district. Some people think that would be a better system. There are concerns there about would that just sort of underscore worries about gerrymandering and so forth. But that's another thing just to kind of throw into the conversation.
Thanks. I've got another historical question. We'll go from historical to legal to more political. So it's a two-part question. Has there ever been a discussion of reapportionment of the states themselves? That is, changing the boundaries of states to reflect differences or changes in population. So think of this as akin to redistricting within the states. So that's the first part. Has there ever been such a discussion? And I suppose, more precisely, has there ever been such a discussion, call it at the federal level, since I know sometimes you have discussion within states of breaking up, like California. Second part, does anything in the Constitution expressly prohibit this? So prohibit that reapportionment of the states themselves?
Well, there's a provision in, I pulled up my Constitution here. The Article 4, Section 3 requires that any reallocation, if that's the right term, of the states, as the provision says, nor any state be formed by the junction of two or more states or parts of states without the consent of the legislatures of the states concerned, as well as Congress. So Congress can't do that on its own. It requires the acquiescence of the state legislatures, and that would be the obstacle to doing it now.
But in principle, not necessarily, in fact, in principle, so long as the states went along with it, you could combine, whatever, Washington and Oregon. You could combine Vermont and New Hampshire.
Right, or break California into 3 states, for example, if the California legislature and Congress agreed to do that.
Would Congress as a whole have to agree? So let's just take California. So California legislature wants to, legislatures want to break California into 3 parts. Congress would need to agree? Senate?
Correct.
And
right.
Huh.
Right. It requires the consent of the Congress as well as the legislatures of the states concerned.
Just by a majority vote, doesn't say more than that.
I think it would be a normal piece of legislation. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Tom, did you have more to say to that?
Well, I mean, as a historical matter, just off the top of my head, the only example I can think of is the creation of West Virginia, but that was bound up with the Civil War, and Virginia didn't accept it. It tried to fight against so we had a secession within a secession. So I think that speaks to sort of the practical, the real world difficulties of doing this. There was a major article in the New York Times not so long ago entitled, let's pull it up here, America Needs to Break Up Its Biggest States. And, the columnist, Noah Millman, makes a pretty logical argument for why this would be a good thing. But I think the points Michael was making earlier about the difficulties of a constitutional amendment at the national level to try to carry these things out at the states also presents itself, as logical as they might be, with lots of political opposition, I think would emerge. But California is a great example. It's nearly 40 million people, larger than many countries. If it were an independent country, I think it might be the 5th largest economy in the world. It's in that sense, it has a lot of clout in the United States, but it's still in reality underrepresented. I think Ayesha made similar points in her presentation.
Great, thanks. Some legal questions. So these questions arise from your presentation, Mike. So what's unclear about the role of Congress in counting electors?
Well, and again, the Electoral Count Act, as I learned when I was doing some media commentary around the time of the post-election fallout this last fall in January, there are provisions that are just kind of unclear about how the process should play out, and what happens if there were competing slates of electors. which of course we didn't have in the 2020 election, but you could have imagined a scenario in which something like that happened. Of course, there was famously this issue about whether the vice president acting as the presiding officer could, as was being argued by the Trump supporters, could have used some kind of authority to reject slates of electors. The vice president's own counsel rejected that argument, and so nothing came of that. But basically, a lot of kind of provisions for what would happen if we had an election that was even more contested with, again, competing slates of electors, and that's where there are some provisions. There are some I see in the news. There's some people kind of arguing for some kind of reforms of the Electoral Count Act that would try to tidy up some of those uncertainties, given that contested elections we've now have experience with them, and to have clearer and more regular procedures would all be to the good.
Good, thanks. Similar question. Can you speak to the idea that electors are not bound by their voters? In other words, that electors could choose candidate X even though the voters in that state chose candidate Y. Is that accurate? And if it is accurate, do you consider that to be problematic?
Well, the states vary on this. Some states have provisions that seek to remove or punish so-called faithless electors, that is, say, electors who won't vote for, in the Electoral College, won't vote for the prevailing presidential candidate. And the Supreme Court actually just last year decided a case that said that the states could do that, and that you could, in case involving Washington and Colorado, that states could punish faithless electors. But there's still the possibility in states that don't have those kinds of provisions that you could have such faithless electors, and that they could throw some votes one way or another. This comes up every once in a while. Sometimes in the last 50 years or so, there'll be one vote kind of thrown away for someone else. The real concern is that you would have faithless electors in a setting where you had an electoral college that was divided very narrowly, and so that's another way in which there might be some reforms at the state level, or other ways of kind of ensuring that those kinds of issues don't arise.
Okay, Mike, this is your last legal question. Then we have some questions for Ayesha, and then questions for everybody. So you have the power to reform the Electoral Count Act of 1887. What do you reform?
I'm not enough of an election lawyer to know chapter and verse of how this would be written into the U.S. code, but basically something that would make it just the right term would be something like more automatic. That basically once the slate of electors had been certified by the state, that there was something that removed any doubt about any role for Congress in kind of mucking about with the results of the election. Because I think that's the nightmare scenario that I think should haunt both parties, right? That somehow you would have a rogue Congress, so to speak, that would try to throw the election somehow back into the House of Representatives, for example, where maybe a party had a majority. Because of course, that's if no one gets a majority in the Electoral College, then the House picks based on the state by state vote of its delegations. And so I think that to the extent that there's any kind of more than a merely ministerial role for Congress in counting electors, I think those are the issues that are most challenging. And so however that gets implemented into a reform of the Electoral Count Act, I think would be all to the good.
Good, thanks. Yeah, I'm not sure how many people knew about the Electoral Count Act of 1887. I can't say I was well versed on it. So, all right, Ayesha, we've got a few questions for you about coalitions. So one is, you speak of a weakness of the U.S. presidential election in that the two-party process eliminates coalitions. But is not the value of coalition building still evident in enacting laws? That is, the president must form a working coalition of legislative members of both parties.
And this is the president in the United States must.
United States. So,
that would be right. That would be rather different from, say, a parliamentary democracy, right? I mean, and the president, building a coalition. I mean, it would only happen after he's elected, right? I mean, it's not like he can build a coalition, but in other parliamentary systems, the voters have that chance and that opportunity, that the coalition building is actually happening before the candidate is elected. And I think that's where it becomes really important to have that process.
Good. Okay. Another similar challenge. Not quite the same, but so to your point about the difficulty in building coalitions in the U.S., could we not say that we have de facto coalitions within parties? So, for example, if we had a multi-party system, it's likely that the various wings of the Democratic Party would be separate parties. Under the current system, they're forced into a coalition under the guise of a single party, or one might say. So what do you think about that? So another way of
I think that's a great question, actually. Because whether we're on the left or on the right or in the center, no, it's none of these sort of models or ideologies are sort of a monolith, right? And there are so many different sort of sections even within the sort of the American left. You have the far left, which you have social democrats, and you have liberals, and then somewhere along the line there are sort of moderate Democrats, and then if you go along the ideological spectrum, you can pick and choose what kind of conservatives we have. But I think given the fact that they are forced somehow into this fold of two big parties, right? Their voices somehow get split. And often I think what happens is that there's a lot more internal bickering within both parties, right? Like, I mean, within the Democrats or the Republican parties and their different sections, they don't seem to always agree on things. Whereas I think if each one had the possibility, even, with independents, to have their own voice and their own political party before, and have that chance to be represented equally, then I think maybe, we would get a more sort of diverse set of, or at least a more accurate, perhaps, if not diverse, but a more accurate representation, rather than, what I mean, like they just have like one block which represents all these other sort of different ideas, but they're not really all agreeing with each other, of course, all the time. Whereas, you have, for instance, in India, you have other backward classes, right? You have the Dalits, you have sort of various urban and rural combinations of coalitions, and I think they kind of give you a more accurate picture of sort of the political differences, even if they could be minute, right? But there are political differences even within our own sort of big political ideologies, I think. So that's my way of responding to that question. But I think that's a very good question.
Good, thanks. We have two more questions from the chat. I'm going to combine these since they're somewhat similar, and then I'd like to hear you three talk among yourselves for just a couple minutes. So these questions have to do not with the Electoral College as such, but with our current two-party system. So is there any practical solution to reforming the highly divisive two-party system and granting legitimate opportunity for independent candidates to get a fair chance in elections? And in other words, how to move away from a two-party system that we have today. So one more time, any practical solution to reforming the highly divisive two-party system and getting independent candidates a fair chance in elections? And that's a question for all of you.
Well, again, it's something that political scientists debate a lot. It's hard to, kind of defend in 30 seconds. I will say that, just for what it's worth, I think that a first past the post two-party system, as we have in the United States, and as there is sort of speaking in the United Kingdom between the Conservatives and Labour, there's been some third-party movements in the UK over the years, but not very successful. I actually think that fosters stability in the political system. And I think that having proportional representation systems with small parties and minority parties, I think risks destabilization. But again, it would require a lot more time than we have now to defend that in detail. But I do think that's a going position, and it's one that I'm sympathetic to.
Interesting. We'd give you another like 45 seconds or so if you want. All right, who's next?
I mean, I think it's as I said before, it's not in the Constitution that there should be two parties. Washington famously warned against parties. They just emerged, and it so happens that we've tended to have two parties. But there is one example when a third party emerged, and that was the Republican Party. It supplanted the Whigs and a number of other contenders. And as we know, that resulted in the Civil War. The political system was overloaded by the emergence of the Republican Party. I mean, I would say just very briefly, and we can't go on for a long time, but political systems have to be judged by their efficacy in handling actual problems. And I don't think judged in that light, the two-party system is faring all that well right now. I don't think we could, you could start to list a number of the great problems that they are not addressing and have not addressed for some time. But how that's solved, I think that history teaches us that tends to come outside of the two-party system. Traditionally, most of the time, the parties absorb those inputs. And over the course of the 20th century, that's probably mainly been the Democratic Party that's played that role. But that always has come, including at the example of the Republican Party in the 1850s, with developments outside of what we call the two-party system.
Yeah, I'll just add to that, saying that, if we do want greater representation, then I think the current model of the United States is inadequate in many ways. And one of the downsides of sort of just having two parties, or the two dominant parties, is that it fosters more polarization. Multi-party systems, of course, have defections, obviously, but people can move from one party to the other easily and build coalitions. So, like Michael said, that can be unstable as well. But I'm not entirely convinced that, the two-party system can also, generate stability without giving enough representation to sort of, independent parties and other groups that don't seem to, feature anywhere in the election process or don't get their voices heard. And so I think that the downside to that is also a voter apathy, right? In the United States, where voters then don't tend to go out there and vote in elections. And in, one of my American government classes that I taught a couple of years ago, that was a problem. I mean, even students said like, oh, what's the point of voting? We were talking about this, but if only two parties are going to get elected, right? And I think that's something that needs to change. So that's where I'll just leave it.
Great, thanks. I wonder if you have any comments for one another or further thoughts that you want to share. We're nearing 8:15, so the floor is yours, whoever wants to take it.
Well, I'll just thank Ayesha and Michael. I mean, it's very good to hear from the other disciplines and political science, the comparison with all these other systems. I learned something, and from Michael, the law, the legal history and the legal present is such a vast subject that it's very difficult, even for somebody who just sort of dabbles in the history of it to wrap your head around. So I appreciated the insights.
Yeah, I want to thank Michael and Tom as well for educating me. Like I said, this is not exactly my line of expertise, so I was a bit nervous, though I have a basic knowledge, and I can definitely speak for like 10-15 minutes. But I did get to learn a lot from Michael and Tom. The historical detail is so rich in the United States, and there's just so many little turning points that one can miss. So I really appreciate that. Thank you both for your contribution.
No, thanks to both of you and to Bernard. I thought it was a rich interdisciplinary conversation, learning from the comparative perspective and the historical perspective. And as I said, given the difficulties of amending the Constitution and so forth, I think that folks should know that the Electoral College is likely here to stay in some form, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't work to improve our communities and improve elections and their administration, and to engage with the process and not to become overly cynical about it, whatever one's views are.
Good. Well, thanks to the three of you. Thanks very much for participating. We'll do this again. Actually, not September 17. I think September 17 might be a Saturday next year. Now, there is one benefit to not doing this in September 17, namely Tom can join us. His birthday is on September 17. There have been some years he hasn't been able to participate because of his birthday. So happy birthday, Tom, in advance. It's also your happy birthday eve,
Happy birthday, Tom.
as well as happy Constitution Day Eve. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Thanks again to the three of you. Good night, everybody.